Welcome everyone to this Diplomatic Studies section webinar. My name is Asaf Siniver. I'm the chair of the section. I'm also co-editor of the Journal of Global Security Studies. I'm professor of International Security at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And it's a pleasure to chair this webinar on how to turn your PhD into a book. This is the fifth webinar that this section has organized this year. We've already had sessions on US-China diplomacy in the Global South, publishing in academic journals. We had a book launch, and last month we had a panel on diplomacy and trust. So this will be the last DPLST webinar for this year. We're hoping to start a new series of webinars in October. So if anyone has any ideas for any events, anything they'd like to publicize through our webinars, please drop me an email and we'll get the ball rolling. So let me introduce our panelists in the order of their appearance. First, we will have Anne Towns. Anne is a professor of political science at the University of Gothenburg, a Wallenberg Academy Fellow, and a director of the Gen D program on the gender of diplomacy. She published her dissertation with Cambridge University Press and an edited volume with Palgrave. And she has served on editorial boards and reviewed many book manuscripts, and is currently writing 2 monographs. The second speaker is Kathy Fitzpatrick, who is professor and director of the Zimmerman School of Advertising and Mass Communications at the University of South Florida. She is a faculty fellow and a former research fellow in the Center on Public Diplomacy in the Annenberg School at the University of Southern California. Kathy is an internationally recognized scholar in public relations and public diplomacy, and the co-founding editor of the Palgrave Macmillan book series in public diplomacy, which will publish its 30th volume this year. Third speaker is Chris Featherstone, who is a lecturer at the University of York. Chris's research focuses on US and UK foreign policy, drawing on foreign policy analysis to explain foreign policy decision-making. I've asked our panelists to start with 8 to 10 minutes of initial comments on the nature of the process of turning a PhD into a book, drawing on their own experiences, some of the pitfalls, some of the challenges, things to avoid, things we can learn from. So this should leave us plenty of time for Q&A. If you do have any questions you'd like to ask, please use the comments or the chat box functions. So this is for me, I think. So without further ado, let's start with Anne, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Asaf, for inviting me to this really interesting webinar. I'm going to talk about 3 different questions or related questions. One of them has to do with whether it's better to produce a book or articles out of a dissertation. I'm going to say a little bit about whether it matters where the book is published. And finally, I also want to say a few things about some of the challenges that PhD students might have when turning their dissertations into books. So on the question of book versus publishing, in my view, from a political science angle at least, does not seem to be anymore any one standard set of expectation of what to publish in order to get tenure in an academic job. I mean, my impression in political science is that that maybe in other disciplines like history, a monograph might still be an expectation. But in political science, it doesn't seem to matter if you publish a dissertation as a book or as a series of articles, or a book and articles, right? So I tell my PhD students generally that it's up to them, right? It's their preference that needs to guide their choices in terms of what they want to publish and how. That said, different departments, I think, have different expectations. So it's really important to be aware of the departments where you think that you might want to work and what the expectations are there. Or if you have a tenure track position, obviously you need to know what your particular department expects. So many US departments, I think the standard expectation seems to be that you publish your dissertation as the equivalent, at least, of a book and produce 1 to 2 articles beyond the dissertation, right, in order to get tenure. But if you only publish articles, then you'd publish the equivalent number of articles, right, which is typically somewhere between 5 and 7 articles after you get your job. But that requirement is higher in some departments and it's lower in others, right? So that's just a standard. And that standard is not set everywhere, right? So it depends a little bit. And then in my experience, expectations in other parts of the world may look different. I'm based now in Sweden, and here expectations are different because you're tenured at the point where you get your job. We only now are starting to have tenure track positions, right? So you need to figure out what the standards are in the country and discipline, obviously, where you want to work, right? And if you want to know more about the Scandinavian systems, you can ask me in the Q&A session. So in short, then I think you can do either, right? I tell my students generally that you need to decide whether you think that your project is better fitted for a book manuscript or whether it fits better as a series of articles. And you will get a job either way as long as you're productive and as long as it's published well. Right? In terms of where the book is published, again, my experience with political science is that most employers do take into consideration where a book ends up, right? Whether it's a university press or a commercial press, for instance. And I would say that virtually everyone recognizes that in general, I mean, not always, but in general, it is more difficult. It's more demanding to publish with a university press, and especially the top-ranked university presses. Right? Some commercial presses, not all of them, but some of them are almost like self-publishing, where the review process can be very light, right? I've been reviewer of instance, but the review process is just a proposal. You never actually see the entire manuscript, right? And if that's the case, that's obviously a very different review process than having your entire manuscript reviewed from beginning to end, right? So the quality of books at commercial presses varies a lot. There are some really good books, right? But there are also some books that might have needed a little more review. Whereas the quality of books at the better university presses is more consistently good, I would say. But that said, obviously not everybody needs to publish their dissertation with the university press, right? It depends. It depends on what the requirements are, where you're looking for a job or for tenure, right? Some very prestigious departments might require a book in a top university press, and then you don't really have a choice if that's where you are or that's where you want to be, right? But many departments are okay with commercial presses, and then you do have a choice. So then the choice, and I think Kathy will probably have more to say about this also, but then in my view, the choice depends on your ambition, right? Do you want to put in a lot more time and effort? Or would you rather have your dissertation come out perhaps a little more quickly, right? Might you later want to move on to a different institution in the future where it might matter that you're with the university press, right? A book generally also signals kind of a larger research agenda, right? That you have a coherent and bigger agenda. Articles can do that as well, but it takes a little more effort, I think, to communicate the coherence of a set of articles, whereas in a book, right, you're communicating it by virtue of it being one publication. Right? And often, I mean, you might be invited to give talks of a different nature on a book versus talks on articles, right? So it matters for that as well. And then I think the choice about whether to, publish as a book or articles also depends, about publishing as with the university press or commercial press depends on your time frame a bit. So if you're in a hurry to get your dissertation published soon, then it might be better to go with a commercial press. They're often a little bit lighter on their feet. They're quicker, right? You get the book published within a year, typically, in my experience. Whereas university presses are not as fast, right? The review process itself might take a year, and then you have the production process, which might take additional time, right? So depending on where you're at in the process, like that might be one thing to consider as well when you decide what to do and where to publish. And then I thought I'd just say a few words about challenges that typically come up when you turn a dissertation into a book. A book is obviously long and complex, and one challenge, I think, from a dissertation is to nonetheless make that book one overarching large argument, right? And that seems to be a huge challenge for most authors, not just PhD students, but for most authors, in my view. I mean, a book is typically very rich. Its material can be used to say many things, right? To many different audiences, to many different debates. You might have spent years developing a complex and deep theoretical argument. You have this really rich empirical analysis, right? And that very complex and rich dissertation can make so many contributions to so many different debates and traditions. And in my experience, a lot of PhD students want to say a lot of things to a lot of people because there's so much potential in their material, right? But that's just not a very good way to pitch a book. I think you need a clean and forceful overall claim about an important contribution that your book makes. So to get your book manuscript accepted with a publisher, you need to simplify, you need to streamline, right? And that means killing some of your darlings, which in my experience, personally, but also for PhD students, a very painful process, right? You have to sort out stuff that you could have said. You have to set things aside, right? And you have to decide out of all the things you can say, what is the most impactful argument that you can make with your book? And then you streamline it to that. Then you can break that down into more, into parts and more, it might be a complex argument, but it needs to boil down into something, right? Major, clean, and big, of great weight, right? And that I think is a bit of a challenge when you're not used to working in that way. And then I think in addition, there's a lot of people seem to have difficulty for obvious reasons that when it's time to turn your dissertation into a book, you're often a little bit tired of the topic, right? You're fatigued, you just want the thing out. You've been working on it for years. But at that point, you might also have to rework the puzzle in the introduction and pitch it in a way that to make people really curious and interested in what you do. And to do that, I think you have to have some enthusiasm and curiosity in approaching your topic, which can be really hard to muster when you just want the thing off your desk and out, right? So, and sometimes, I advise my students, what I did myself in my dissertation was I took a break. I didn't look at it for 5 months, right? I put it aside and didn't look at it. I worked on other things. And then I came back to it. And then I saw that there were a lot of things that needed to be cleaned off, right? That need to be cleaned out, that it was too messy. But I could also find a little bit of enthusiasm and curiosity about the topic and the question again. So that might be a way for you to find, that kind of energy that you need to really write in a tone and with enthusiasm, right? In the introduction and the book proposal, so that you convince others that this is a really interesting topic, right? That's under-investigated, that you really need to read this book, right? But that, in my view, is a challenge that a lot of people have by the end of the book, that it's very hard at that point to get back to what it was that made you so curious about the question to begin with. Then I'll stop there and let Kathy, I think, take over.
Thank you. Thank you, Asif. Honored to join all of you. Thank you, Anne. Let me begin by just echoing some of Anne's excellent comments. I don't think she said anything I disagree with. I think the practices may be more common than people might think in terms of academic presses, university presses, commercial presses. I absolutely agree with that, with what she had to say about that. It depends on where you are and what the expectations are in your department, in your school, in your college. What I always advise is new scholars and educators is do what you need to do to get tenure anywhere, not where you are. Because if the standards might be a bit lower, if you're at what we sometimes call teaching institutions, then the scholarly standards might be a bit lower, but you may not want to spend your career at a teaching institution. And unfortunately, we've all seen a few folks who didn't really establish a robust research agenda that would allow them to move on to other institutions. So very much support what Anne was saying about the differences and the rigor and the expectations associated with university presses, and also with just getting your work published. Part of my role today, I think, is to talk from the perspective of a book series editor's position. And in 2009, my wonderful colleague Phil Sieb, who some of you know, and I co-founded the Palgrave Macmillan Global Public Diplomacy book series. And Phil has since stepped down, and Vivian Walker is now co-editing with me. And as Asaf said, we're on track to publish our 30th volume this year. So we've had a good run with public diplomacy, and it's been a great experience as well. And I have a lot of experience with editorial boards and things like that too. In terms of submitting I'm going to try to talk to a few things maybe that Anne didn't focus on specifically. For our series, and I think for most publishers, the book can come in different doors. For example, I work directly with authors who are interested in submitting a book, and we might work the last year, for example, had many meetings with an author who was trying to get a book in order, and it has now been accepted and it's in publication. So that is sometimes how it starts, with an editor who might work more closely with someone, but it also can come through the acquisition editor's door. A lot of times scholars submit directly to the acquisitions editor, and then the acquisitions editor will share with the series editors, and then we review and offer comments, and then maybe it goes back to the author, and then the author would submit the package then. What are we looking for primarily? Again, echoing what Anne said, what's new here? What's the contribution? And to be able to articulate how your new work extends, expands, refutes, debates what we already know. So what is the new innovative contribution that your book will make, and how will you make that in the way that that you present it? For a series like ours in global public diplomacy, of course, we're also looking for context. We have received proposals that, and have sent them back with comments to say, I don't think your proposal mentions public diplomacy anywhere. It might be there, but you haven't placed it within the context of public diplomacy scholarship. So you want to think about how you position your work within existing works in whatever the series is, if you're working through a series editor. Again, the core thesis, one of the most difficult things I think for all of us is to get the main idea down to that one sentence, the one line descriptor. What is this book about? It's the old airline seat conversation when you're sitting beside somebody. Tell me about your book. Well, it's about what? And that one sentence is critical because it has to capture the essence of the work, your argument, your thesis, your thoughts, the newness of it, and so forth. So what is that? And then the expanded overview of the project, so that the editors get a really good picture of what you're trying to accomplish here and how you plan to accomplish it. When you're talking about, for example, in a dissertation, since we're focused on turning dissertations into books, I mean, you may have, you've got a chapter or two on methods. Well, we probably don't need a chapter or two on methods, but how you got there is important in terms of establishing the validity and credibility of the project itself. So when I talk to authors who have written dissertations or theses, as I think some folks call them, it's about transformation, truly. I had a proposal not too long ago. Someone sent the proposal, and then they said, I'm attaching chapters from my thesis. We don't read chapters from a thesis. I'm sorry. We don't, it might be brilliant work. We don't have time to do that. So you really have to transform it into a book manuscript, and that takes time. It's painful, as Anne said. A lot of times things get left on the cutting room floor that you're really wedded to. And what we often talk about is, well, that's an article. Take that piece out, but don't discard it. Use it in another venue for a talk or for an article or something like that. The submission packet for Palgrave, and I think pretty much for many publishers that I'm acquainted with, is pretty similar in the sense of the proposal package. I'm happy to share Palgrave's proposal requirements with anybody who's interested. But in addition to the proposal, which has general information, as I've said, the brief description, full description, the market and competition, how similar is your book to other books already on the market. So those are pretty standard items that a publisher will ask you about. For first-time authors, we typically would require an introductory chapter that outlines the whole book, and as well as sample chapters. With more established authors, we might say, okay, we've seen the work of these folks, and so we're comfortable that this book will be and do what they are suggesting it will. But for new authors, we typically ask for the proposal and introduction and sample chapters as well. For the review process, again, the book ideas can come through different doors, and that really doesn't matter in terms of the review process, because if it goes first to the acquisitions editor, who, by the way, occasionally will get something from another editor at the same publisher, who sends a manuscript or proposal over and say, this looks like it's a better fit for this, or it might fit with the series. So when it comes to the acquisitions editor or to us, the series editors review it. We make comments. Our goal always, I mean, we want to publish great works. And so our goal always is to help authors make their work better and to work with them so that when they get to the point of submitting to the acquisitions editor for full review, it's in pretty good shape. And so we'll do some early work up front. And then once the work is kind of signed off on by the series editor, the acquisitions editor would review and sign off, and then it goes out for peer review. And we typically ask, or the publisher asks the author to recommend some peer reviewers who are acquainted with the content and the subject matter. And once the peer reviews come back, then it goes back to the series editors. We comment, add our comments, and agree, disagree, and ask the authors to comment as well. It's not a situation, it's much like journal publishing. You don't have to make every change that the reviewer suggests, but the publisher typically, the editors typically want you to address it, to say, well, this reviewer clearly didn't understand what we were trying to do here, because here's what we're trying to do. So you just have to respond to that. And then after the peer review, sometimes depending on the status and then, you know, the state, I guess, that the manuscript might be in, it might go back out for peer review again. Not always. It really depends on how many revisions are needed. If it's major significant revisions, it could go back out for peer review one more time. And I'm going to quit there, and I'm happy to talk about questions, but I want to share with you a book. Every time I work with a new author, I say, read this book. It is brilliant. I have worked with this editor, this author offers webinars and seminars, and I'm not on her payroll, but I am, in fact, we're going to have a session at my university, and I've bought everybody copies of this book because I just feel so strongly about how good it is. It's called The Book Proposal Book, A Guide for Scholarly Authors by Laura Portwood Stacer. And I really think it is outstanding. It walks you. If you have your idea, you have your dissertation in hand, she will help you walk through step by step by step to turn it into a manuscript for a book publication. And she even addresses specifically how to turn a dissertation into a book. So Asif, let me stop there, and happy to take questions.
Great, thanks, Kathy. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Asaf. And thank you very much, Kathy and Anne. So I will give a bit of a different perspective here. I am, now 3 years out of my PhD. So, you know, different perspective on the process. So I've recently just, well, not all that recently now, actually. I'm halfway through finishing off some of the comments of on my book manuscript from Palgrave at the moment. So I can give that perspective on pitching your book, developing the process, and maybe some of the painful decisions you have to make over what you are cutting, and can you actually get yourself to make that painful decision? And yes, you can, absolutely. So I think the first thing to say would be the initial, I was always told to call it the elevator pitch. Developing that is your key starting point, and I think that guides a lot of what develops after that, right? That actually developing what is it that you want to say with this book, because it's not everything that you've said in your PhD. That is unrealistic, right? In your thesis and your dissertation, you're going to, you know, say and contribute a little bit more and in a different way. Okay, so having that ability to give your elevator pitch, number one, it's very useful for guiding the conversations you might have with mentors, supervisors, or, you know, book series editors, just to guide that conversation in terms of where you can start looking, how you might develop these ideas. But it's also helpful for you in terms of developing that focus, that emphasis that you want to place on this process. So I definitely recommend thinking in the last months of your PhD as you are going through. Also, once you're on the other side, once you've made it through, have a look at how you're going to develop that initial pitch. Secondly, I would also say it can feel like a very mysterious process. I think it's an experience that I have shared with quite a few people, and it's something that is shared by almost all of them, I've got to say. It feels strange. It feels very weird, right? It's not the way that you would do submit a journal article, for example. So it is just not going to be the same experience. So exposing yourself to some of the requirements is a really useful step to just demystify the process a little bit. So these kind of events are obviously a brilliant way of doing that. But another way to do it would be to look on the websites of different book publishers, right? Look at their proposal forms. As far as I remember, the vast majority have them available to just download. When they don't, they give you an incredibly detailed list of what you should be involving in your book proposal anyway. So just looking through them, most will be asking for incredibly similar things, right? There are certain things that they all need to see. What is your main contribution, related titles, all these kind of things. So looking through that and clicking through or scrolling down the Word document, I think it is for Palgrave, looking through and thinking, okay, what are they asking me for in terms of information here? So I would say that that is a really useful way of determining what do I need to develop beyond my elevator pitch. What am I developing? What kind of one paragraph summaries do I need to have available? And what am I going to stress in those different pieces? And as I mentioned, when you look through this, it will look through these forms. You'll start to see things like questions about related titles. Okay, that was one of the biggest stumbling blocks. Personally, I'm sure Asaf remembers, who as my supervisor, we had some interesting conversations about this. I was convinced, right, I have to show I am different to everyone ever in all ways. And no, you don't. You absolutely don't need to be able to do that. Okay, what you need to be able to do is show there's a market and someone actually wants to read this. So if someone else has published something on a related topic that is going to show an editor, this is worthwhile. But okay, you can try and pitch yourself and show yourself in relation to that work. Why should someone listen to you? Why should someone read your work? Well, it's on a related topic. That book is on multiple reading lists. It's available to read. It's been widely cited. Something like that. On the topic, you'll be able to show people are interested in what I'm saying here. I think one thing that also was fairly interesting in the proposal process for me was the emphasis that different publishers placed on the kind of policy audience. Okay, it is a bit different. If you are trying to speak to a policy audience alongside a scholarly audience, you need to maybe think about how you are going to do that. Whereas, maybe with the scholarly audience, you can show that through related titles or reading lists that your book might appear on. With a policy audience, they typically want a little bit more of an explanation of how you are going to reach out to that community and why they might be interested in your work. Okay. I think in terms of choosing a publisher, echoing, I think, I hope, what Kathy and Anne have said about what do you need career-wise? What do you need and what would you like to do career-wise with this thesis? Make it work for you. So, you can have conversations with mentors, conversations with supervisors, and ask them what would be a appropriate range of publishers to look at, firstly, but also what would be your advice for pitching this? What is there a chapter in there that actually it's not contributing as much as you'd hoped, or it's slightly off the topic as you have developed it now? So as I think Kathy mentioned, is that actually a paper? Is that actually a journal article taken away from the body of a book manuscript? Okay, so having a conversation with mentors about where you might like to go, but also looking through your bibliography and who have you cited, who have you found particularly persuasive, what kind of styles do you really like? If there's a particular series of books that you've been citing a hell of a lot, why are you not looking at that publisher, right? Have a look at what they're doing. You can also pitch, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. but you will usually get some really useful feedback. So I definitely stress that, you know, it's a engaging process. It's an ongoing process. It is not a one-stop shop. You know, you are not going to immediately, as soon as you finish your PhD, write your proposal in a couple of weeks, shoot it off, and everything's golden. You're all the way through. There will be an engaged process. You'll have to have conversations with people. You have to think about how you want to pitch these things. So getting it going is always a useful thing. And I think I'll call it quits there.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, all. This has been really useful. Well, I think we've already got a few questions. I want to give the opportunity for other people to gather their thoughts and ask us some questions as well. So I'll just add a few comments just to reiterate some of the concepts we made. I absolutely agree with what Anne and Kathy said about the notion of fatigue, that you finish your PhD, it's taking you 4 years and more, and the last thing you want to do is to look at an academic thing ever again. And read it again and change it and make it more marketable and more commercial. And especially when you have other things on your mind, whether it's a postdoc or applying jobs and so on, turning some of your PhD into articles. But I think it's really important to look at it more strategically and more long term, because you've already spent so much time on this manuscript, on this PhD, that it would be a shame to leave it on the floor. Even if it means spending another 6 months to find the right publisher, to write a really good proposal, and to make the necessary changes. And this is something that all you speakers have alluded to, and I really can't stress it enough. I've never come across anyone who simply submitted their PhD as a book manuscript and it was accepted. That rarely happens, if at all. Your book needs to read like a book and not read like a PhD dissertation. And even at the most basic level with the title. So I'll give you my own example. When I finished my PhD, I was so eager to get it published that I didn't even consult with my supervisor. And I sent my proposal to OUP. And the title of the book was the title of my PhD, which was Structures, Processes, and Personalities in US Foreign Policy Decision Making. And which sounds incredibly dull and incredibly boring. And I don't think they even read my manuscript proposal. They probably just rejected it based on the title alone. The supervisor wasn't very impressed with it. So I spent a lot of time with him working on my manuscript proposal. Obviously, changed my title and sent it to CUP, and gladly they've accepted it, and it was published about 20 years ago. But the point is, again, and Chris alluded to it, and in some cases, obviously, we generalize them here. And with the methodology, for example, which is such an important part in the PhD, it's not always the most relevant, the most important part of the book. This is usually not what most people will want to read and find interesting. And of course, you can turn it into an article and so on, but you really need to think about what will appeal most to the widest market. And a chunky methodology section is probably not the right way to go. The other point, which is perhaps common sense, I guess, look what these publishers have published in your area previously. I think Chris alluded to it already. Not all publishers, even if they are OUP or CUP or other top university professors, they are not the best in the world in every single area. And we all want to publish with the top publishers, but it could be that they're not the right publishers for us in the area that we work on. And this does not mean that we are not good scholars or good academics. The fit is much more important in that sense. And again, as Chris said, all you have to do is look at the online catalogs, look at the manuscript submission guidelines. They're on the websites. They're very easy to find. And they're extremely detailed, and they tell you exactly what they want to see. Make sure you do what they ask you to do. So if they ask you to talk about a competition and do some market research, then please do it. And if you don't know how to do it, speak to your supervisor, speak to your academic mentors, and speak to other more senior people in your networks. Don't just second guess and chance it. It really pays off to spend a little bit more time and to really turn your manuscript proposal into the best document you possibly can produce. I think we've got plenty of questions already, so I'll leave it at that. I think some of the questions have already been answered between the four of us. So I'll start with the Q&A rather than the chat box. So I wanted to know how to go about publishing a master's dissertation that is about 17 years old, but it has a topic that is still relevant today. If you don't mind, I'll just very quickly. Again, I think we've answered this question. If you think it's relevant today, if you think there is a market for it, based on what we've just spoken about. So if other people write in your area, clearly it's still relevant. See what they publish, go to the publisher's website, see what is required in terms of submitting a book proposal and start there. And if you're not sure it's the right fit, there's nothing wrong with sending an email to the commission editor and say, look, I'm thinking of doing it. Is this something that you might find interesting? And I can send you the book proposal and a couple of chapters. Another question, what does commercial press means in the case of political science and IR? So by commercial presses, basically we mean non-academic presses. I think some presses have been wider reach. So correct me if I'm wrong, Kathy, but I think that Algrave, for example, tend to publish sometimes, or certainly some of the subsidiaries that do publish things that slightly more commercial and less academic. So I don't know if you want to say a bit more about that. So I think usually we associate CUP and OUP, Princeton and the others as sort of the top tier of university presses, but some of the larger publishers also publish things that are not strictly just academic.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And there seems to be, I'm no expert, but there seems to be more of a trend toward hybrid books so that publishers are interested. And it gets back to what Christopher was saying too. Are there policy implications here? So, you know, traditionally we might have thought of a scholarly book contributing to theory and theoretical development of concepts and so forth. But the idea of the practical implications, the policy implications is important. And so, and that's part of the audience, as Christopher was talking about, who might buy this book. It speaks to the market as well. How many copies of this book might a publisher sell? And I believe it's becoming a little bit more hybrid because everybody wants to write a bestseller, but all scholarly books are not going to be bestsellers. But if there is a market beyond scholars and students, then that say so. You know, and say why you think that there will be interest in the policymaking world, for example.
Anne, would you like to add anything to it, or should we move on?
Sure. I mean, I don't have anything really to add, I think, on the commercial university presses other than to say, so Palgrave, Routledge, Edward Elgar Publishing, right, Sage. I mean, those are some of the bigger ones where I think political science IR scholars publish. And I think, you know, if you have a master's, my dissertation that you would like to publish, again, like as Asaf said, try to make it relevant, try to pitch it in a way that, show how it's interesting still. And then maybe it isn't a good idea if it's policy relevant to pitch it as that as well. I mean, I think that's the only thing I have to say about those specific questions. I think I don't know if we should turn to the chat. There's, so there are questions in two places. I don't know if you noticed.
Yes, I think, so another question, publishing houses ask for a timeline in the research, in the manuscript proposal. Given that you have to transform something that is already written, from your experience, how much time is needed? What is a sensible time frame? Chris, would you like to answer that based on your experience? Because I know you.
Yeah. So I mean, I'd say in terms of a timeline, this was one of the stumbling blocks personally. You know, you think, yeah, of course I can, I can crack it out all really, nice and quickly because I know all the subject. I've just written my PhD. It's just rewriting. I can do it. And then Asaf had a look at my timeline and told me that you are not going to do that. That is just fun. There is no way this is happening. You are not going to get this done in 6 months. Deal with it, right? You've only just got a new job. You're teaching quite a lot at the time. 6 months whilst teaching is and also Asaf knows my working style. He knows that it's realistically a bit a bit unrealistic, right? So it was a bit of a mysterious process personally, but it's also something that is a bit adaptive, right? You can say, okay, this is my proposed timeline. And I think people are quite understanding of first-time authors. So do reach out to your mentors, do reach out to supervisors and pitch one, but also at the same time, if you get it wrong and you say, you know what, I actually need an extra month, I need an extra 2 months, people are not, horrified at the prospect of it taking an additional month. So apologies. So personally, I think from the time of being contracted, I said it would take me 12 months, and I'm still so far on track to be hitting that one. So yeah, it's 12 months for me from the point at which the reviews were all accepted and I was told, yeah, get going. 12 months was a relatively realistic one for me. I'm in a teaching focused position, so I do teach more than a traditional academic in the UK. So, during term times, I'm actually not doing all that much work on this, right? But outside of that, it's very achievable. And also, sorry, I just wanted to pick up on one of the things that was said earlier on about that kind of need for maybe a bit of breathing space after your PhD. I definitely needed that. I did finish in the midst of COVID, so that was probably also a part of that. You're trapped at home in a lockdown in the UK, so it wasn't the most conducive atmosphere to refreshing and getting back into the project. So I took 6-7 months off from any work on the topic at all. Started applying for jobs, and then actually that space really helped me get a little bit of distance and approach it once again with a bit more of a fresh perspective.
Please. We have an onslaught of questions, which is great to see. So we better move very quickly there. But just very, very quickly to say, only you can answer this question. How much time is needed, and the only thing I would say is be honest. If you think you need 9 months, then say 9 months. If you think you need 2, then say 2. And like Chris said, do not overpromise. And do not underpromise either. And if you think that you need more time after the initial period, they will understand it, because their interest is to publish the best book possible, and not the quickest way possible. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. So a few more questions. I've published 3 articles for dissertation. Will that negatively impact my possibility of being accepted for books? So basically, can we publish or can we include in the book material that's already been published elsewhere in article format? And secondly, I'm in touch with an acquisition editor and submitted proposal. I'm also working on a chapter. Do you think I need to wait until my proposal is accepted before I start working? And I would like to take that.
I can take a stab.
Yep.
I think, one of the things that editors will look for is novelty, right? So when you publish 3 articles, it's not necessarily a problem, but you need to pitch the book in a way so that those articles are not necessarily just merely reproduced in the book. Or if they are, they need to contribute to a new and different overall argument in the book. So you can reuse some of that material, but it needs to be situated differently in a different kind of overarching aim, right? I mean, sometimes for my dissertation, I had not yet published anything out of it when it was turned into a book. And that can also be negative, right? Because then the editors don't know if your argument is tried anywhere, right? So you can turn it to your advantage that you have 3 published articles to say, look, this has gone out and it's been reviewed and people really like these arguments, right? Now I'm putting them into this book and I'm turning that into something else. So I would pitch it that way. And then as to the second question, the question is whether you need to wait until the proposal is accepted before starting working on the chapters. I would probably not do that. Like, you will get feedback and you will get suggestions, but you don't want to, it might be a long process, right? Depending on where you've submitted it. I mean, I had to wait, I think it was a year before I got a response on my book with Cambridge. I couldn't have waited for a year, right? Like, so there were things I knew had to be done. So I did those in the wait, right? But it's a little bit tricky to answer because, On the other hand, like they might have things that they want you to do, and then you might do some work in vain. But I think that I would probably do the work that you know that you need to be doing for the book before you get the answer from them, would be my response to that.
Also, may I just add a PS to the question about journal articles already published? Obviously, you want to think about copyright, because if they're published, they're copyrighted, and the journal may own the copyright. And so you'd have to get permission to use content that has been published elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I just want to add that wearing my journal editor hat, and this is something that we come across quite a lot from graduate students, who will take usually the conceptual framework and the main thrust of the dissertation, and they'll use it in an article that they submit to the journal. Then it will come up as a really high similarity score, which may raise the questions of plagiarism. And this is not a problem. I mean, obviously, again, once the PhD or the dissertation is submitted and published in an online repository, then it will flag up. It's not an issue as long as you're very clear in usually your cover letter or your email to the editor that certain chunks of the manuscript, the article, do draw on your PhD. And it's not a problem, but you do need to acknowledge it. Because we understand that you can't, you can actually submit things in an article which draw on your PhD. That's absolutely fine. But the other way around, as Anne said, originality is really important. So with my CUP book, for example, one of the chapters that I proposed had already been published as an article, and they said we have to remove it from the book because of copyright issues and also because of originality issues. So like we said earlier, just be honest in your manuscript proposal. Say exactly what you intend to publish elsewhere if this is part of your book proposal. For first-time authors, is the expectation that we have full manuscript ready when we approach university presses? I think we answered it. I think, Chris, you type in the answer now. And again, the vast majority of publishers will only want to look at, I think Kathy responded to it as well, look at a couple of chapters, usually the introduction and then the framework of one of the case studies. But again, if you look at them online at the guidelines, they will tell you exactly what they would like to see. We have another question on the general costs for the author associated with publishing and how do they differ between commercial and academic presses. Correct me if I'm wrong, there are no costs that are associated with the editor when it comes to publishing your book. The only exception is with the indexing. Usually you have two options. You either pay for the index, so the press, they commission a freelance indexer to do the index for you, or you can do it yourself, and that of course won't cost you anything. But as far as I know, that's the only exception, but correct me if I'm wrong, any of them.
Yeah, that's in my experience, that's true. Personally, the fee I would be paid for the manuscripts is precisely the amount of money that it would cost to get the indexing done. So you essentially say, you tick a box on the form and say, yep, you can keep that fee if you index it for me. So it means I don't have to read the thing yet again.
If I might, you also might want to consider a copy editor. If not a developmental editor, a copy editor can really make a big difference.
Another question, can you submit proposals to multiple publishers? You absolutely can. So it's not like with journal articles where you can only submit one to one publisher, to one journal at a time. But publishers will expect you to acknowledge it in your book proposal. So there's nothing wrong with submitting to more than one publisher at a time. You just have to make sure that you acknowledge it in your book proposal and say, in the manuscript proposal, and say that this proposal is submitted to OUP. Please note that the submission is currently also under review with CUP or Paragraph. And that's all you need to do. And of course, if you hear from one before the other two, they'd appreciate if you update. But there's nothing wrong with submitting multiple manuscripts.
And another PS to that too, in my experience, once you have reached the stage of peer review, the publisher will very much hope, if not expect, that you wouldn't be continuing to work with other publishers because of the effort involved in sending your manuscript out or your proposal out for peer review.
And it's quite likely, especially if you work in a relatively small field, that, you know, 2 or 3 different publishers will ask the same people to review the proposal.
Yeah, yeah.
That's happened to me as a reviewer.
Is your sense now that like manuscripts don't go out for review at multiple publishers at the same time?
Well,
Because
I know
have
that,
had the experience that it does.
right. Well, and that's what I said in my experience. Paul Grave asks an author, once they get to the point of peer review, you know, to please not submit elsewhere or continue with other publishers. They request, they don't demand. I mean, I'm sure it would depend on the product and what, you know, how popular it was and so forth. I don't think they require it. I haven't heard them say that, but I know in working with a recent author that once it reached the peer review stage, they said that, you know, our hope is that you won't continue to submit because we're taking the steps now, you know, to move it through peer review.
And
So,
another question, which I think we've sort of answered, is it an issue if the thesis is available in open access on an online database? I presume it's in terms of whether we can then publish chunks of it in article format. I think we've answered this question, right?
I think so. I was, as with a lot of this stuff, I was asked about it, and it's part of the requirement at the University of Birmingham, where I did my PhD, that it is publicly accessible. You can ask for it to be paused for a year, but generally it's simply a case of just making the publisher aware that, yeah, just tell them that it is. And it was never raised as an issue beyond that for me. It was just they wanted to be aware of whether it was or was not. But yeah, just tell them.
So could I also do a PS thing to Elvina's question about like whether a first-time author has to have a full manuscript? My experience is that yes, you do, right? You can approach a university press before your manuscript is done, but they will not take just a proposal and a couple of chapters at university presses from a PhD, you know, from someone that haven't published with them before. And I think that's true for more senior scholars as well, that when you go to a publisher that you haven't published with before, they often ask for the full manuscript. That doesn't mean that you can't approach them. You can approach them before, but they will not send out for review, in my experience at least, just a proposal and a couple of chapters, as they do in the commercial presses. There they would, right? And or if you like, you know, if you published with a university press before, the second time, they might just send out the proposal and a couple of chapters. But the first try, they want to see the whole thing, right? So you can initiate like a conversation with them, but I think places like Cambridge are not going to, you know, they want to send out the entire thing.
I just add to that, I feel incredibly smug and fortunate that you mentioned it, because I actually had a reverse experience with OUP just recently. They actually did not ask for the full manuscript. And I think it really depends a lot of it on who the commissioning editor is. And I agree with you. I think perhaps it helps if you're more senior colleague and have a track record of producing, you know, in the time frame. But even if it's your, you know, you can in your manuscript, and they ask you to specify when the full manuscript will be ready, right? So you can say, you know, I'm attaching the introduction, I'm attaching chapter 2 or chapter 3. The full manuscript will be ready in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months. But as Anne said, you know, it's unlikely that we'll offer you a contract based on that. You might want to see the full manuscript, especially with the top university presses. I think it's very different with, you know, with Routledge and other publishers. I've published with OUP and CUP, and it was a very, very different experience in terms of the peer review process and just working with the editor compared to, you know, when I published with Routledge, for example. Both as an author and as a reviewer, by the way. So I think it really depends. It depends on the publisher. It depends on who the commission editor is. So yeah, I think it's a mixed experience. Chris, did you want to jump on that?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, you know, you're absolutely right that it's, you know, it's the process of approaching. I don't think you need to wait until you have everything ready before you approach the any press, I think, really. But, you know, there is you know, if you send in a couple of sample chapters, I actually found it a really useful process to speak to. It was MUP for me, Manchester University Press. and actually sending in introduction. I can't remember which of my main body chapters, but 2 chapters sent in with a proposal, and actually the commissioning editor was great and was able to work with me a little bit more, and that made the process of developing the full manuscript, I think, I mean, obviously you've never done it before, but I think much more slick. And so it was a much better process, I think, personally. So I would say it's okay to approach them. And actually, the worst thing they will say is, well, okay, yeah, interesting, but we want the full manuscript. Well, then you just need to crack on. But it can give you some really useful guidance in that initial stage, especially for a first-time author, I think.
We've got some really, really good questions. This one is a chunky one. It's a really good question from Oslim. So this is a question about what happens after your proposal is accepted. So what is the process of writing or rewriting the dissertation research for you? So I presume you mean more in response to the comments in the review process. So how do we adjust and revise the manuscript accordingly? And what would be some of the recommendations that you can give us about tailoring our writing from a dissertation to a scholarly book? So 2 very good questions. Who would like to go first?
Asif,
can
I'm
say
sorry, I couldn't
something.
hear clearly what the question was. Would you mind repeating?
Yeah, sure. So can you hear me now? Is that better?
Yes, better.
So the first question is, how do we respond to the feedback? So after the manuscript has been accepted, presume for the review process, how do we respond to the comments in terms of rewriting or responding to feedback? And secondly, what are some tips and advice we can give about tailoring a writing or adapting a writing from a dissertation to a scholarly book? Which is
I
something
think
that
Anne was going to say something.
Go ahead, Anne.
I was going to say, I think that the process of once you get the feedback might look different depending on who your reviewers are, right? And then the process after that, my experience now, having seen both tons of colleagues get there, going through this process, having gone through the process myself, it looks very different from different presses. And even if you take like just the top university presses, it seems very different. Right? Like my experience in Cambridge was essentially hands-off. I hardly did anything to my manuscript after I got the reviews. There were some light comments. I integrated those. It took us, I've had friends published with Cornell University Press, for instance, where it's almost like, I think I'm unstable, but there I think it was line by line editing, right? Like very careful, very close editing. And I've heard the same, I think at Harvard and some of the other presses, right? So I think it's very different depending on what press you're working with. Or so maybe you should ask people, if you have presses in mind, try to talk to people that have experiences with that particular press, because it's going to look very different, right, in different presses. With the commercial presses, I mean, often it's not very much. I don't know, Kathy, if you guys offer more, it sounds like you might be working more with the authors. But so maybe there it varies a lot too. I mean, my experience there has been that you barely get any feedback and you don't really get any editing or any,
No, I agree with you,
Yeah.
Anne. I think it's a myth that publishers offer editorial services, which they just don't. And when I was saying that I work closely with authors, that's kind of an individual choice of the series editor. I mean, there's no obligation to do that. I mean, the process is the proposal comes in, the series editors review, the acquisitions editors review, and then decisions are made, comments are made, and it may go forward for peer review. But I do sometimes work more closely with authors who have great ideas and they want to develop them, and so. But that's on the conceptual developmental piece of it to help them get through the review process in a positive way and move their work forward. The publisher does not offer editorial services, and that's why I was suggesting to consider a copy editor. When I published my book, I hired a copy editor, and I'm a pretty good editor, but I still wanted somebody going line by line, to make sure it was perfect. And if you need developmental editing, obviously there are those services out there, but the publishers is not going to offer a lot at all. Once it moves forward, it moves forward. You'll get, it will be proofed, and the author, I mean, the in-house folks will look at it, but no, say, man.
The second question was, any recommendations in terms of how to adapt a writing style from a PhD dissertation to a commercial or a scholarly book, rather? I mean, my advice is the similar advice I give to my PhD students when they try to write their first peer-reviewed journal article. And I say, well, read peer-reviewed journal articles and see how these people write in terms of the structure, in terms of the engagement with the literature review, in terms of developing the argument, and so on. And I think my advice would be the same with books. So, read the relevant books in your area and see what the writing style is like, how the argument is structured, and those kind of things. The one thing that I think is applicable across the board, and generally the expectation is that the book will be less jargon-laden, and it will be more appealing to, to people who are not scholars, to people who are not academic. And I think, again, in most cases, a chunky methodological section is probably not necessary, and the contribution or the claim of originality and significance needs to lie beyond the realms of academia, if you like. It needs to have some kind of a real life relevance. It needs to be relatable and relevant beyond your Bible, basically, that experience. And would anyone else like to jump on that?
Yeah, if I can, I'd say, as someone who did publish an article with Asaf, I can tell you, yes, he does absolutely give that advice to all of us. So I would say the best advice is to speak to the book series editor. It can be a very different experience based on who's available and what they see as their role. But I'd also say reading, if you are looking at a particular book series, reading books in that series, right? How have they structured it? What kind of formatting are they using in terms of subheadings, headings, that kind of stuff? But also the tone, how they try and guide the reader through what you're doing. It is a very different process than a PhD or a PhD thesis. But yeah, I think reading other people's work and then analyzing it in terms of tone and style rather than purely in the terms of the actual argument being made. Obviously, that's a key part of it. But what is it that you actually like about the style? And are there elements that you think are really useful? Is there something that actually you could incorporate within your writing style, as a guide for yourself? I think the big tip that Asaf started me off with was remove any expectation of just going through the script and removing thesis and putting book. That you're not doing that kind of stuff. So I think my best advice would be that distance that you might get over the process of writing your book proposal, that time away, is a very, very useful part of that experience. So having it as a separate process and really considering it as a rewriting task, not an editing. You're not editing your PhD into a book. You are rewriting. There might be some stuff that gets transferred across pretty easily. There will be some stuff that never makes that transition. So treating it as rewriting is going to be much more useful, I would advise personally.
Please. We've got plenty of, we're going to have to move forward. I'm really sorry because we've got so many questions to go through. I feel like a radio DJ, just fielding questions from listeners. So Andrea is asking, what is the difference between articulating the innovative point of our book, so where's the contribution, and the marketing competition section of the proposal? So what's the difference between the book's originality and the marketing competition, which is one of the sections that we asked to explain in the manuscript proposal? Who would like to take them?
But I'll just speak briefly to it, and maybe Anne wants to. I mean, the one-line descriptor, which captures the essence of the book, is very different from the marketing competition part of it, because that gets back to what Christopher was saying, that it's another myth that if somebody's written a book on this topic, that nobody's going to want your book. In fact, that's just the opposite. If there is a market for books on a topic and your book fits within that and extends, expands, elaborates or what have you, then that's a very good thing. But that's very different than the innovative new idea that your book brings to the market.
I agree with Kathy. So, and the two need to hang together at the same time, right? Because you need to, like, I think when you talk about the so-called competition, I think it's always good to think in terms of like, who are people that are close to what I'm doing? What's the community of people that will probably read what I'm writing, right? And write about them in positive terms, right? What is it that they've done that's great about this topic? But what is it that they didn't get to, or that, you know, it wasn't what their book was about, right? So that you can then say, like, what's innovative about what I do is something that their book doesn't really address, right? So I would say always write about the competition in appreciative terms, in terms of what they, you know, what they've contributed, but what, you know, as a collection of 10 books, what do we not yet get from these people, right? Mm-hmm. So something that's constructive, appreciative, right? That in a generous spirit reads like what others, the labor of others, and then what is it that you bring to the table that they haven't done yet?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Another great question from Ricardo. It's a really good question. What are your thoughts on publishing in more activist-oriented presses like Verso or Pluto? I suppose we could call it more sort of polemic kind of scholarship. What are your views on that? I suppose in terms of, will that affect your academic reputation in a certain way? Should we aim to go for those kind of publishers as a first manuscript? Any thoughts on that? It's a really good question.
I can start if no one else wants to start. I think, I mean, you're asking the question for a reason, right? Because you sense that there might be something there. And I think it, you know, those are very good presses, and there's there's excellent scholars publishing with those presses, right? So in that sense, like, there's no reason to worry about those presses, I think. And I think there are a lot of departments, and at least in Scandinavia, where a press with Verso or a book with Verso Pluto, if it's a good book, will count just as, you know, just as much as with any other press, right? But that said, I also do think that they're, you know, you're calling them activist presses, and in places where there's pushback against what sometimes gets called activist research, it might be a little bit controversial, right? So that's my sense, at least. I mean, I don't personally, I would never, like, if I was the reviewer of people applying for a job, I would not disregard someone's book with Verso Pluto. I think those are very strong, you know, presses, and they're, again, award-winning academic books that have come out with those presses. But that said, I do know of people that have, you know, issues with so-called activist presses, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think I agree with you. I think it really depends on the individual and the individual context. And I think, and by the way, just to broader context, you keep making references to OUP and CUP because I think, like it or not, many people in academia, there are sort of shortcuts to excellence, and I know of people who publish some very poor scholarship in OUP and CUP, obviously present company excluded. So it's not necessarily where you publish. There's no guarantee that if you publish in those places, it doesn't make you a better scholar. And I agree with Dan. I think at the end of the day, whether it's for promotion purposes or appointment purposes, you would hope that the people in charge will read your book rather than just look at who the publisher is. But I also understand why it might be almost a strategic choice for some people whether to go down sort of that route as opposed to what some people might consider more sort of objective, if you like, academic scholarship, which personally I don't subscribe to, but that's beside the point. So again, I think it's an individual choice, and again, it's one of those things that you might want to speak to your, whether it's your supervisor or mentors in your network and more senior people. I mean, my advice to my students has always been sort of start at the top, whatever the top is in your field, and if it doesn't work, then you walk your way down to the library. Just said, spend so much time on the PhD, and might as well spend a little more time to make sure you can publish it in the best place that is relevant to your area. But there's absolutely nothing wrong in going in a different direction. It really depends on individual circumstances. I don't know, Kathy, if you want to add to it or should we move on?
No, I agree. I think what you said, reach for the stars, go with the best press for your topic.
Yeah. Can I just jump in and say, you know, as someone who's, you know, freshly off the job round, I'd also say, think about the narrative of explaining the why behind your choice, right? That if you are going with a particular publisher, it's also very important to be able to say why. It wasn't just the first one that you Googled. It was, you know, okay, there is a purpose to choosing this this publisher. And so articulate it, make it clear to people. You know, so provided you have a narrative behind it or a reason, I think generally you're okay.
Thank you. One more question from Paulina. Can we talk about money issues, the cost of a book workshop, negotiating a contract, other financial costs? So I think we briefly touched on the indexing issue. So you can do it yourself for free, or you can ask the publisher to commit me to a freelance indexer, and that will come out of your either upfront or out of your royalties or an advance payment if you're lucky to have one. And that, I suppose, leads to the second part of the question about negotiating a contract. At least from my personal experience, but I think all three of you would agree with me that as an early career scholar, with this being your first manuscript, I wouldn't negotiate too hard. I wouldn't drive the publisher away over a few more percentages on the royalties. So I just felt extremely lucky to receive a contract from CFP. I think I was offered, obviously there was no advance payment, and I think it was something like 2.5 or 3.5% royalties about 20 years ago, and I just signed the dotted line without negotiating. Obviously it's a bit different now, but I wouldn't worry too much. I think the important thing is to get your book published in the right place with a good publisher. It's spreading your CV makes you very attractive in the marketplace. And other than the indexing, I don't think we need to worry about any other financial aspects. Would anyone like to add to this point? Kathy?
In my experience, there's not a lot to be negotiated. In fact, in my time with Palgrave, they've gone from paying a tiny advance and royalties to now just paying an advance up front. I mean, maybe you can negotiate for copies of books or something like that, depending on your marketing plan and so forth. But I would agree with Asaf, if you want to get your book published, you want to get it out there. And in my experience, scholarly presses are not. I mean, universities might be different, but not with the commercial presses.
Yeah, I mean, there really wasn't much negotiation involved, if I'm honest. You're not getting rich off this. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But I think, the copies of the book, they were fairly open about that and said, oh yeah, of course, there is some movement there. But I don't drive too hard.
Another question, that's a huge question. We can have a webinar just about that. Actually, there was a webinar just about that yesterday, about AI, the use of AI. So the question is, can you use AI tools to proofread your proposal or chapters? Is this acceptable? I've got a lot to say about it, but I'll let the others speak first.
I want to hear what you have to say about it, because I don't know what to say about it.
Go on, Chris.
I was just going to say, as far as I know, it's completely down to the publisher, and the majority that I've come across have said, nope, not doing it. Not that I've asked to be allowed to, but most of them have some form. I think the ISA has a blanket rule as well. So it's fairly easy to find, but I think it would be surprising if they let you use it all that much.
Anne, would you like to try and answer this question?
Sorry, I have no experience with it whatsoever, so I have nothing to add to that particular. Apologies.
So what I would say with AI, obviously it's a new territory for everyone, for authors, for reviewers, and for publishers. So Chris alluded to ISA. Certainly with ISA, all ISA journals, there is a policy that actually, if you submit an article now to an ISA journal, to many journals now actually, you'll need to tick a box to say that first of all the is original and was written by you, and if you did use AI, in what capacity. So was it, for example, for proofreading? Was it for editing purposes? Obviously, anything beyond that, to put together a literature review or to put together an argument, that's beyond the pale. I mean, on a different level, I would say I understand why some people would do it, especially if the first language is not English and perhaps they can't afford a copy editor. But just be very careful, because we know that AI is still it's very much developing on a daily basis almost, and it does lose the human touch, the more in-depth sort of critical level that we would like to see in writing. So even when it comes to just proofread, certainly I see it with some of my students who use AI, because we do it in seminars as a learning tool, and sometimes it does read a bit it's quite robotic, if you know what I mean. I don't know how else to explain, but there's no soul to it, and so it may look very professional, but it's almost soulless, and it doesn't read as well as you'd like. And I can understand why, again, it's a problem, or it's a challenge to do it without some kind of proofreading. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, it was lagging. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay. One thing occurred to me now that I heard at a seminar was that here in Gothenburg that also consider that whenever you put your text into an AI tool, that text might also be part of the material that tool has to work with, right? So if you enter an article and then someone else happens to write a question that's very close to your article, they might get an answer that comes out of your article, right? I don't think that's the case for all AI tools, but it's ChatGPT is that way, for instance. So also be aware that you're handing over your ideas, right, as you enter a text into some of these tools. So that's the thing I think also to worry about, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's an excellent point. And also, eventually, who knows when, but I'm sure it's not too far in the future, there will be, anti-AI detection softwares. There's always, an action and a reaction. Just like, we have with other sort of plagiarism software. And I'm sure there will come a day that these softwares will be as advanced as those tools as well. So it may not be such a big issue with proofreading per se, but anything beyond it, and I think it might pose an issue. And I'm conscious of time. I think this was the last question. So I don't know if any of you would like to add some concluding remarks, and then we'll bring this webinar to a close. Anyone? Yes, Kathy?
Two quick things. One on writing, quality matters. Back to what we were talking about before. I always say clear, concise, precise. I have seen some great ideas get lost in dense writing, and it breaks my heart, but you have to be able to write well and present your ideas in a clear fashion. And the other thing I always say is it's your book. At the end of the day, you're going to get great advice from a lot of folks. They're going to tell you, and much of it will be so helpful, meaningful, useful. But at the end of the day, whether it's reviewers or others, it's your book. And, so keep that in mind. You don't have to change everything everybody suggests you should change. So own it and be happy with it.
Thanks, Kathy. Chris, Anne? You don't have to go.
Happy to jump in. I'd say, yeah, it can be a very mysterious process, but I think what Kathy said about it being your book and that ownership is a really key part of it. But I would say if you are starting on the journey, expect it to take a while. Expect it not to be a direct, clear linear path. But at the same time, it's a very rewarding process. It's a very interesting process. And I think the first stepping off point is thinking about that, one-liner. What is this book? What are you doing here? That is the best way to get into this subject. And then just looking around at the different publishers' sites and what do they require. It changes between different fields. So it's much more advisable to look at specific publishers that you might be interested in publishing with, rather than taking mass general advice. Political theory is very different to IR, for example.
Maybe I'll say one final thing too, in addition. I mean, these are really wonderful things that have been said already, but one additional thing to think about too is, I think as you transition from being a PhD student to this person that's writing a book on a topic, try, also to step out. I think being a PhD student involves a lot of anxiety and a lot of proving yourself, and a lot of proving yourself to particular people in your department that you admire and that might not like each other and whatnot, right? So you have a lot of different voices and audiences in your head, and then a lot of self-doubt, right? But I think when you write your book, you should leave that behind to the best that you can, right? And just try to find your own voice and do some daily affirmations, right? That you are now the super smart authority on this topic that you've spent years working on. So I think the tone and the tenor in your book should reflect that. It should not be the anxious PhD student, right? Trying to please two different advisors. It should be you convincing an audience, right? A community of scholars that you want to speak to, that, wow, look, I have come up with this really interesting question, right? Or it's a new approach to this question, or it's a new, whatever your novelty is, right? Try to find enthusiasm and some place where you feel good about what it is that you do, right? Which is, I think that's hard. For me, at least, that was hard. It was, I went to the University of Minnesota in the late 90s and early 2000s. That was peak Minnesota, peak theory, post-structural IR stuff, peak anxiety-inducing stuff, right? So for me, switching into finding a tone and a voice that was mine, right, was really important to writing my book, like Kathy said, owning it, that I wasn't writing my advisor's book, or I wasn't writing the smartest PhD student in the program's book, right? It was my book. So, yeah.
I think this is a really good advice to end on, and I can see Chris nodding, and I think he will testify that we've had these conversations many times in the past, that you're no longer a PhD student, and you need to imagine your book on the shelf next to other people. Some of them are very big names, but you are not part of the conversation. And you should think about how people will read your book and engage with your book in the future. So, and it goes back to what we said about an hour ago. This is why it's not just a replication of your PhD. It's much more than that. And so I think we leave it at that. I hope you all found it very, as useful as actually I've learned quite a lot from this process. I'm sure our panelists have learned something as well. Found it very insightful. Thank you so much for all the great questions. As I said at the beginning, this webinar is recorded and it should be available online on our website and on the ISA DPLST X account, hopefully next week. Thank you so much for attending, and I'll see you all soon. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.